Okay, we're back to our deep dive of the PMBOK 5th edition, and this is Module 21 now. Finally, we're going to develop the project schedule way down in Module 21. And then we're going to show you how to control the schedule. So here we are. Here's our time management overview knowledge area for the knowledge area. We've already looked at 6.1 through 6.5 where we've first obviously developed our schedule management plan, how we're going to do this stuff. Then 6.2, we identified our discrete activities from our WBS, brought those into our discrete activities, and that in itself created our project network diagram of just the activities and the way they are, and then we sequenced them in 6.3, put them in order, with their dependencies, their logical dependencies of finish to start, start to finish, the four of those as appropriate. No leads or lags yet. Then in 6.4, we've assigned resources to those activities, be it people or materials or subcontractors or whatever, that we need to execute that activity. And then finally in 6.5, we actually applied now the time duration to accomplish each one of those activities by the assigned resource. Okay, now, finally, as you can see way down here, buried down here, another indication of why you shouldn't sit down right away when you get a project charter and start cracking out a schedule. It's way down here after all this fundamental good, best practice, fundamental stuff that goes first. And now finally down here, we'll be able to produce our actual project schedule. So let's look at this, and look here, 13 inputs to develop the project schedule. So even though we've done all this stuff here earlier, all these other inputs come to bear to produce a really good project schedule. So let's look at those. 13 inputs, wow. So you need all those though, all the advice we get from these plans and other external capabilities that come into us to analyze the activity sequences, to analyze the durations that they're right, the resources they're right, any constraints that we may have, which you would get from the scope statement that comes in primarily. And we do that to create what's called the project schedule model, and that has our planned dates for completing those activities. A couple of modules ago we talked about the project schedule model, the presentation model, the scheduling tool, and some other schedule data, some other attributes. 7 or 8 of those terms, you need to know what they are and differentiate between them in case you're quizzed on them, which you most likely will be maybe a couple of times in the PMP exams. You need to know what they are so you can answer with, intelligently and with knowledge. So, but here we're going to create the project schedule model. Here's our data flow diagram, which has, all these little dots. They're all the inputs. A lot of inputs come in. We probably know the answer to this. We've said this, gone over this several times. Why do we need resource calendars from acquire team and procurement? Well, obviously our team has resource calendars, and conduct procurements will have some resource calendar considerations of our third-party suppliers. Make sure there's nothing lurking there that's going to complicate our project. So that all comes in. Here's sequence activities that produced that step, that activity, 6.3, when we sequenced things, finally we ended up with what we call the project schedule network diagram. Okay, I've also found, my own experience early on, and many project management practitioners from my associations and so on, say that even though this is a key diagram in helping sequence activities and getting all the logical independencies right, many project managers don't even use a network diagram. They go directly to like a Gantt chart type of presentation, like Microsoft Project. They don't use the feature where the schedule network diagram is produced, even in Microsoft Project. And if you look there, it is kind of quirky the way it does it. It's hard to manage, and there are different management systems, project management information systems, that provide you even different, maybe perhaps even better views to be able to manipulate the schedule network diagram better. But nonetheless, you should use it because it has a very particular value to you, especially if you're doing critical chain or critical path methodology, which we'll see here too coming up. So that comes in. Of course, our resource requirements come in. Here's our activity list. It comes in, of course. Durations, time, time, cost, and the scope, which is the activities. All the triple constraint stuff comes into this schedule. And the output is project calendars now, finally. We have a calendar of who does what when. That's a big output. All this raw schedule data. What is the schedule data? Well, that's what WBS, what resource, how much it's going to cost, milestones, all the stuff that contributes to creating a schedule is your schedule data. One of those list of 7 or 8 items you need to know. And finally, down here, the project schedule as we know it best. So, and of course the schedule goes out now to help and determine the costing budget, because we're going to do costing then too. So now we have the actual schedule, we can apply costs to those resources and create a budget and manage to that too. Of course, the schedule may have activities that require purchasing from outside vendors, whatever. So I go, down here, 12.1, procurement management also requires a project schedule as an input, and of course your project management plan is continually updated with these kinds of things as they're built. So yeah, project schedule, schedule baseline. Oh yeah, I should mention that the schedule baseline now is a product of the developed schedule. I mentioned this earlier. Here's project schedule, as we said, goes two places, out internally and externally there. And the schedule baseline is at any point in time, if you baseline it, your project schedule, you're putting in actuals, you know, as you go along. Did you do this? Yeah, I'm 10% complete. Okay, fine. I put 3 hours on that. It takes 10. Okay, you put 3, partially complete. Your project schedule is a living document. But at some point, and you do it first earlier, you say wherever your project schedule is, you baseline it. Okay, and that's your baseline. It's exactly the same as your project schedule at that instant. And then 1 second later, it starts to change because you add actuals and so on in there. But as you calculate, you'll find that you're still within your schedule baseline. And if you start getting out of whack, you may need to re-baseline it. And there's tools, techniques for us available that we'll see later to help us determine whether we actually have to do a re-baseline or not if we're not successful in bringing it back into compliance with the baseline. Okay, here we are. Here, you might recall this way back when we talked about integration management. Here, I'll just review this. Here is all these, quote, outputs from other processes, unquote. The only time it's ever used is right here in 4.2 as an input. And down here, the schedule baseline was one of those, and now we're at that point where this makes sense to us. So it comes back into integration management as an update to the project management plan. So, which is just what we have right down there again. So, input, schedule management plan, the how-to, what scheduling method we picked, and we'll see what those are here, comes into play, is real important right now. And that's how the schedule is calculated. You can calculate a schedule different ways, so here's how we're going to calculate it. The activity list comes in. It has all our work package activities. Remember, all your activities roll up into an accounting package called work packages, and they roll up into a bigger accounting package called a control account. So work packages, your activity list, attributes, these are used to actually build the schedule because they have your time, your cost, your resources in them when you get cost. And in the real world, you might have cost in it by now. We can't do everything at once here, so we're doing it this way. Activity, resource requirements, what kind of resource, how many. The duration estimates, again, quantitative, they're numbers, and there's various ways you can determine what is that duration. You have these analogous parametric 3-point value ways of coming up with your best estimate, most intelligent, informed estimate. You deal with your contingency and management reserves for risks should they occur. And you make these quantitative assessments with a qualitative group consensus. So you mix the two. And the most likely work periods to complete the activity with your estimated resources are part of your duration estimates. Resource calendars, again, your human resource calendar, and the ones for procurement, and also what you have that you can capitalize on, particularly with procurement, but also if you have third party you're hiring, a subcontractor, you need to know what their work schedule is. Maybe they're pre-assigned to some other work, so you have to get your best use out of them on your project before they're released elsewhere. So availability of internal and external resources. And here's your RBS. Which RBS? Well, this is the resource breakdown structure here we're talking about. You can do resource analysis, operational reporting. You can use that to your advantage for that, and also it's a good handy tool to help identify more risks from a human resource point of view, or even materials point of view. Project staff assignments. We did that way back when we did a human resource management knowledge area. We created our project staff assignment when we went and acquired our team. So which resources are assigned to what activities? That's your assignment, and you get that right out of your schedule. And of course, the project schedule network diagram has your predecessor and successor, logical connections, start to start, finish to finish, finish to start, start to finish. They'll do all those things. No leads and lags yet. Okay, we haven't applied those yet. So no leads and lags, again, which are arbitrary constraints or constructs, rather, that we as a team would apply to make certain adjustments to meet certain different needs of the project, exclusive of the time of the actual activity. And the scope statement is there because we're still worried about assumptions and constraints that are in the scope statement until those are updated and revised out over time. So we need to still know what those are because they will impact or could have a big impact on our schedule. Risk register, all identified risks that could affect our schedule. We need to consider all those always, all the time. Internal, external stuff here, standards, scheduling tools, methodologies, calendars, whatever we have available to us, we need to use and capitalize on to make our job better. So now this is going to get really fun when we come back. We're going to talk actually now about the tools and techniques used to create our schedule network and finally the schedule itself. Okay, well here we are now at develop schedule. 6.6, tools and techniques. This is where it gets really interesting. This is where you get to manipulate the schedule itself to meet your project requirements. Schedule network analysis is a big tool and technique. What's involved with that? This generates our project schedule model, which is an integration of all of our project data, all of our scheduling methods that we choose to use, and the scheduling tool integrates them all. Project data, what is that? That's one of the 6 or 7 definitions you need to know. Project data is your start time, stop time, your duration, your cost, who's involved, your milestones, your constraints, things like that. With your schedule model, which may be critical path, critical chain, you may optimize resources, tools that we can use, and we'll see some examples of that coming up, and the tool itself. So all of that together gives you the project schedule model. Now this is one of these scheduling methodologies you could use, and that is a critical path method here. There's also critical chain, and there could be others, but this is the one that is primarily used in most shops, you know, and the way you calculate critical path is you take a, here, I'm going to get my mouse over there. You start here, you go through here, you can see here's your template, early start, early finish with a duration. So here's our durations here in the middle that we've estimated will take that task A. So it takes through here, through B to here, and you finish over here, and then you go backwards for the ones down here, which are your late start finish. You do it down here. And there's a method and a madness to the way you calculate the stuff. You can do it by hand. In my own class, I have students actually by hand calculate a more complex activity schedule network than this, so they understand, but by far you certainly don't want to do that by hand. You want your project management information system and the scheduling tool as part of it. You want that just to do it at the press of a button. But you need to know conceptually why these things are happening, because you're going to need to manage the outcome. So basically it calculates it back for your early stuff and goes backwards to calculate for your late stuff. Now this is a very simplistic diagram right here, network diagram. You may have, you know, many, obviously hundreds and thousands, you know, of activities in your chart, and they're not going to be straight line like this. This one you do here, you do A, you do B, and then you do D, you do A, and then you start C and you do D. You could have B going off, being a dependent of E, and when it's done you come, and then you do C, and then it goes to D. All these logical relationships that we've linked together that we saw before can apply here. And then you have float. Well, basically the critical path, it calculates, again, the early finish and late finish and start dates and all that stuff. Float. See, here we have float, total float. See this down here? You'll calculate the total float. That means B can wait. It can be delayed between the start and the finish of its task for 5 days before it affects something upstream. Okay? And then at the end, the last one has what free float. Here is 30, late finish, early finish is 30, I'm sorry, down here the path is 30 here, 25 up here. If you look at this path is 25, the lower path is 30, the difference is 5, that's called free float. You need to know the definitions of what free float means and what total float means when you're talking about critical path. Now we could spend all day going through detailed analysis of just how, you know, what is really critical path, how do you calculate this stuff. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but you know, if you're using critical path or you're intending to use it, you really need to take a very specific focused look at it from some another source, you know, but it's a very powerful tool if you need to use it or want to use it on your project. But you need to know these basic concepts for the PMP exam. So you need to know total float, free float. You need to know basically, you know, how to calculate. And actually, the PMP exam may give you a simple diagram like this and ask you to calculate something out of it, either the float or the actual total duration, or fill in some of these early, late finish boxes. You need to know how to do that. Anyway, total float, you can have positive float or negative float or free float. Negative float's another one. Now, this is best when you have adequate resources, when you have, you're not limited on the resources you have available to you to accomplish activities. When we look at critical chain in a minute, you would use critical chain when you do have limitations on the resources available to you. There are other methods to try and manage the schedule to compensate for the lack of people. Okay, but this is considered, you know, when you do have people, you have more flexibility here to adjust your schedule. Let's look at this definition. There are a lot of different ways of describing just what is the critical path, and depending on the words you use, you got to be very careful or you're going to be misinterpreting really what it means. This is a pretty good definition here. The critical path is the longest duration through the network diagram. Okay, like if you add all these items up, you're going to end up with 30 down here. See the path, A, C, D, 30. Okay, up here it's only 25. So this is the longest duration down here. This is your critical path. And over here, okay, the longest duration, it determines the shortest time. to complete all the work. You say, whoa, that's kind of strange. The longest duration to determine the shortest time, but that's what it is. So because it's, by nature, because it's your critical path, it is the longest path through there, but it is actually then the shortest time that it takes to create or to finish your project. You need to know a definition like that. Okay? So now here's critical chain. This is where you have limited resources. You use a different concept here. This is good for compensating for uncertainties. It has an endpoint project buffer, and it has these interim feeding buffers. Okay, here's where you would put arbitrary time in there to compress and expand your schedule to meet your needs. Non-critical chain feeding buffers. Here's your critical chain in the middle. So no feeding buffers in there because there is no room for buffer. No extra time in your critical path, whether it's here or a critical path method. There is no room for buffering. But you can buffer these other things with these fake, not fake, but they're constructs of time you put in there without resources, best with limited resources. So again, just understand why you need to use this kind of scheduling methodology, critical chain versus critical path, and the concept of feeding buffers and project buffers, and PMI actually in their exam may call it just a buffer. Okay, but if they're talking critical chain, they're talking this kind of concept here. So if this is what you want to use, again, it's beyond the scope of this course here to get into detail really on how to use this, and it's a fascinating topic if you want to like do more research on it on your own. Now we're talking about resource optimization techniques. You know, you're going to have people, and they're going to be doing their work, and you don't want to assign. You know, you may be misassigning resources, and you don't know it until you finally produce your schedule, and you find out, well, Bob, he's working 18 hours a day. You know, you can't have that. You need to get him, you know, down to 8 hours a day, or whatever is required by you and your management. If there's overtime involved, fine. You know, but you don't want to burn people out. And you got to be reasonable. So you need to like smooth that out, your resources, and that's called resource leveling. So you actually adjust the start and finish dates so that you can balance that with the supply of people and their time. An example here. Before you level, you know, here's Tom 8 hours, here's Sue with 16. You know, you don't want Sue to have 16, and here's your actual network diagram up here. Activity A, Tom, 8 hours for him, and Sue 8 hours for her. And oh, and by the way, this is a good point here too. Back when we're assigning resources to activities, you don't have to have a single person. You can have multiple people contributing. So, you know, whatever it takes to do that activity. Now, if it gets too complex, you may want to break up that activity into more than one activity, if that's the nature. But sometimes it's okay to have, you know, this like this with 2 people or more in an activity. It's up to you to decide what's best for you, and the best way to manage the project is up to you. But let's say this is the case. And activity B is also assigned to Sue. That's where she gets her 16 hours. And then later on, when A and B are done, Tom can start his 8 hours on C. Well, that's really no good. So you do your resource leveling. So you have A here, 8 and 8. And you created actually another activity B for Sue, her part of the 8 hours that was in the original one up here. You split that out, you know, another activity. She does it on the next day. And then, you know, you do C later on. Of course, what this does is here, it's pretty obvious, it pushes it out another day. You know, that may be okay if it's not on the critical path. If it's on the critical path, now you're a day later. Okay, and you may not want that, so there are methods of compensating for that too, and it's called crashing and fast tracking, and we'll see that shortly. But the concept here is this is how you resource level. So now they're all happy, they work 8 hours a day, they can go home and have a nice time, come back the next day and do the remainder of their work. You know, they may not care that the end date's pushed out a day, but you do, and we'll see about that. Now there's a second option we have to do a resource optimization, and this is called resource smoothing as opposed to resource leveling that we saw before. Resource leveling before would affect the critical path if you were leveling on the critical path. Here's resource smoothing. Now this is where you're manipulating resource elements of activities that are not on the critical path. So you can manipulate your activities to adjust the 8-hour, 16-hour thing for activities that are not on the critical path, and then obviously it doesn't change the completion date. And it does that by using the free float and the total float that are available in those paths. And remember, you wouldn't have any free float or total float on the actual critical path. So that's why it wouldn't affect the critical path. So you can adjust those resources in that manner to smooth people out. So now here we have some modeling techniques now once we have our network analysis and our network diagram the way we like it initially at this point in time anyway. We can do what-if scenarios, and we can do simulations to try and actually optimize the schedule to meet our needs. What ifs, they have adverse conditions, feasibility. What if this happens into our schedule? You can plug in delays and things and see how it affects your critical path or the end date, regardless of what methodology you're using. Unexpected conditions, same kind of thing. Adverse events, maybe a risk response kicks in. And now we have to take, you remember our time reserves that we have for known risks? Maybe we have to take a week and fix because some disaster happened that we knew might happen, and now it did. So now we're a week late. So we can say, what if that risk happens? And we take a week. You can see the effect of it. And what if multiple risks happen? You can see the aggregate effect of that with what if scenarios. Yeah, and it's your contingency response plan readiness. That's actually how you would test and evaluate whether those plans are good and the magnitude of the impact on your project. Simulations are like the Monte Carlo, if you remember. They're like the 3-point estimations. They're simulations of estimates and this and that, especially Monte Carlo, a computer you need to do because it does hundreds and thousands of iterations to try and optimize the best schedule given the inputs you give it. So other ways of modeling to determine, just what is the best arrangement of our resources and the times and the durations to achieve our end date within our requirements. Modeling techniques. Schedule compression. I'm doing this a little bit out of order than the tools and techniques are listed for a reason, but here's schedule compression, where we actually shorten the schedule if we need to. And we're going to look at this in a little more detail right when we come back. Okay, schedule compression. This is a technique used to shorten the schedule if possible. Let's look at that. There's two methods to shorten the schedule: crashing and fast tracking. You can crash the schedule. You can car accident, crash. Boy, all of a sudden your car is shorter than it was before. Well, that's crashing. Basically, and it's only used on the critical path. Crashing is only on the critical path because your critical path has what? 0 float. So when you shorten an activity, it will bring in the critical path to some degree. If you shorten it too much, there may be dynamics in your schedule that now create a different critical path. But in essence, it'll shorten the critical path fundamentally. So only on the critical path, and you may want to pay overtime for people to work faster, well, not necessarily faster, but work more on that day in that duration time period, remember, per day or per week or whatever, to bring in the schedule. You may add people and add extra materials to accomplish more work within the same period of time. Pay a premium for expedited deliveries to get things in earlier. Crash the schedule, make things earlier. So duration may if you have a lag in there, going to reduce the lag perhaps. And we haven't done leads or lags yet, but if you did, that could be a factor. But of course, it may increase the cost and the risk. When you crash a schedule, there's always now a risk involved because you're doing more than you had actually planned to do originally. That introduces some risk, burning out your people, whatever it might be. And you have a less incremental cost than with other options. Now, fast tracking is different. That's where you do 2 tasks that are one after the other, sequential, finish to start, if possible. And this does not. Well, first you put them underneath each other, so now they're done in parallel. It still may be a finish to start, but you've introduced actually an artificial lead here. So you can do this, and that will bring in your schedule here. That's called fast tracking. Yeah, you perform sequenced tasks now in parallel. And now this, of course, also may increase risk and rework because there was a reason originally why you had this one after the other. So when you're trying to do them in parallel now, there may be some conflicts or things that are not really executed properly because you're on top of this other task now. So the risk may go up also with that and rework. If you do it wrong, you got to do it again, and then it defeats the purpose of fast tracking in the first place. And you can do both. You can do crashing and fast tracking, wherever you need to do it and try to bring that end date in and compress the schedule. That's what it is. Now, in order for any one of these to be effective, like down here at the bottom it says, either one of these must shorten the project execution duration totally overall, or it's not effective. Obviously, why are you doing it if it didn't make a difference in your end date? So these are 2 techniques you could use, crashing and fast tracking, to shorten the schedule, called schedule compression. Okay, here now finally we're going to talk about leads and lags. The lead. Okay, you have a activity here from the finish of it to the start of your next activity. We're going this way from my point of view anyway. So a lead is so here's your predecessor and here's your successor. So this advances the successor relative to the predecessor by some arbitrary time that you put in. That is your lead here. And the opposite is a lag, where the elapsed time between these two is compressed, this way. Okay, so leads and lags, you put those in to adjust the schedule and so on as you see fit. Scheduling tools, automated schedule model generation. That's what your schedule tool is. Again, go look up that definition. You'll need to know what it is, as opposed to schedule model, as opposed to schedule presentations. You need to know what all those are so you can respond to a proper question on that. But basically, the key here is automated. And I mentioned earlier, some project managers just can't get out of the spreadsheet mode, but that does not offer them a great deal of flexibility and efficiency in more complex projects. You do need a really good, robust scheduling tool for larger projects. Not that they're not good on small projects either, but certainly for a larger project. So, given all the inputs, well, there are a lot of them, and all the tools and techniques we use now to adjust our project network diagram, apply our leads and lags, do our crashing and fast tracking, and depending on what schedule methodology we use, which would be critical path or critical chain or something else perhaps, whatever we do now, we can finally output our schedule, and we can baseline it when we're ready and say, okay, here's what we're going to manage to from this point on until we change the baseline if we have to. So the main output of 6.6 finally is develop the schedule and produce the schedule baseline, which at that point in time again is exactly equal to what? The project schedule, which is the living document that we use day to day to take actuals and put them into the schedule. If it took 2 hours to do a task and the task said you only need an hour, okay, well now you've gained an hour in your project schedule. That may or may not change your critical path depending on where that activity is in your network diagram, but it might. And likewise, if it's a 2-hour task but it took you 5 for some reason, as an actual, your project schedule would reflect that, and that may or may not affect your end date. But certainly your schedule baseline does not change. It still is 2 hours and 2 hours only, regardless of what the actual is, and that's what you're trying to manage against. So if you do too many of these delays, for example, you need to have some techniques at your disposal to try and bring that back into compliance with your project, with your baseline, such as crashing and fast tracking and so on. So schedule baseline. This is the direct input into 4.4, which is monitor, not the execution of the work, which is 4.3, but 4.4, where you monitor and control the work that's being done. Here is your baseline. Well, obviously, it's your baseline. It is your metric that you will now measure against to determine project performance and whether corrections need to be made or not. And here's another instance. If you actually look at 4.4, you won't see, quote, schedule baseline, unquote, as a direct input into 4.4. It comes in under the guise of project management plan, which is the scope baseline. It's in there too. So schedule baseline is a project management plan component. So if it was only the schedule baseline that had impact in the managed project work and control work, it would say that. But many other plans also contribute to monitoring and controlling work, so it comes in under the umbrella of project management plan. So here's your project schedule, which is your living document. At that instant of your baseline, it goes on to be modified with actuals. Scheduled data, what is all that stuff? Again, it's all your constraints, your schedule activities, your milestones, your resources, your durations, your costs. All that stuff is scheduled data. And the first time you create your project schedule, and you say, okay, let's push the button now, officially, boom, here it is. You can have no actuals because you haven't done anything yet, nor should you be doing anything until you finally set your schedule and baseline it. So your first cut at baseline has no actuals. And this is a direct input to our next process, which is 6.7. Now you're going to be controlling that schedule to the baseline. Project calendars are output now because you've sequenced everything, you've crashed, you've fast tracked, you've done whatever you need to do, leads and lags, to come up with what satisfies you as the final end date. Okay, so now you can actually then produce through your project management information system. Your automated tool will provide you with the actual project calendars of all your resources. Project management plan may possibly get updated, actually it will get updated when you baseline your schedule. Whenever you baseline anything, your project management plan gets updated because it's a component of that. So obviously we're going to update the plan at this point with that baseline. And if we made any adjustments to the actual management plan based on our experience with working with it, we make those adjustments too. And again, not limited to just these things, could be others. The project documents are updated as needed, particularly your resource requirements and the attributes. They may be adjusted as you're working to build out your final schedule. Calendars, and of course your risk register itself may be updated because you find more risks and so on. You've done your reserves, scenarios and so on. You may change those. Again, not limited to, so those are the outputs. So finally, after all this, we should have a really good project schedule, and now our baseline that we can go off, start building the product and managing to that baseline. So when we come back, we're going to talk about now controlling that schedule and the tools, techniques we have for that. So see you later.